Whether it's testing the limits of the hardware to see what it's truly capable of, or just having bad optimization and a project leader with an out-of-control ego, there have been plenty of games over the years that have taken the consoles or PCs they released for and declared the envelope to be pushed. The key thing every developer needs to work on is finding the right balance between the two, both graphically and mechanically. Unless you want to choose chaos, a shocking number of devs love to choose chaos. I'm Sai for WhatCulture.com, and here are 10 video games that pushed consoles to the limit. Number 10, Crazy Taxi, Game Boy Advance. Crazy Taxi was one of the best games Sega ever produced. A fast-paced 3D driving game about getting your passengers to their destination with as much mayhem and carnage as you can possibly stack up along the way. Many fans believe that only a dedicated arcade machine could truly capture how absolutely insane the game could be, with home console releases like the Dreamcast only doing their best to keep up. So naturally, they put it on the Game Boy Advance. About half of this list is going to be made up of the bad side of games taking their systems to the limit, and Crazy Taxi is a perfect first example. The entire game is crammed and crunched until it fits on a handheld, ruining more or less the entire experience. While undoubtedly impressive that they managed to get anything resembling the original game on the GBA, it doesn't save this version of Crazy Taxi from being one of the most perplexing ports in gaming history. A great example of a dev team being all about coulda rather than shoulda. Number 9, F-Zero GX for the GameCube. It's been quite some time since the last F-Zero game, probably because Nintendo is still scratching its head wondering how to top GX. F-Zero GX was one of the most intense racing games released during this generation, and probably the one before and the one after while we're at it. Few games are equal parts this fast and this unforgiving, going at speeds that will make other racing games' heads spin, while also demanding precision aim and quick reflexes from the player. Frankly, the fact that this didn't set everyone's GameCube on fire was a miracle. Games like this simply didn't happen on the console most of the time. In fact, what makes it more hilarious is that it was developed by a division of Sega, Nintendo's one-time rival, getting the most out of their console. F-Zero GX tests the limits of the GameCube's processing power like nothing else that was released for the system, as the only thing more stunning than the game's mind-melting speed is how seamless the frame rate is most of the time. Number 8, Xenoblade Chronicles for the Wii. Speaking of games that by all rights should have lit up their consoles like a Christmas tree, Xenoblade Chronicles. The original release of the game was for the Nintendo Wii, and it looked bad, like really bad. But then again, what do you expect? Considering the size of the game, it's a wonder all it took was a massive graphics downsize to get it to fit. Xenoblade Chronicles is the closest many of us will get to know the feeling of playing alone in a long-abandoned MMO, with staggeringly large areas bursting with stuff to do. Few JRPGs are so successful at making the player feel microscopic in the face of the world they're traversing, and the fact that those mad lads over at Monolith Soft managed to cram it all into the weakest console on the market at the time speaks to just how powerful the Wii truly was when you have a team that knows how to work with it. Add onto that rich, complex real-time combat that at no point lags in the frame rate, even with a bunch of stuff happening on screen at once, particularly in later fights, and you get a game that will put your Wii through its paces. Number 7, Resident Evil 2 for the Nintendo 64. Discs revolutionized the gaming industry thanks to their memory space allowing for, well, more of everything. This is why most third-party companies went over to the more esteemed competition during the 4th console generation, leaving poor Nintendo holding the bag with the N64. The PlayStation and Dreamcast simply offered more freedom for what they could do with their disc-based consoles. But that doesn't mean every third-party dev abandoned Nintendo. Some managed to make it work with the cartridge system, one of which was Capcom with Resident Evil 2. You would think that Resi 2, one of the biggest and most advanced games of its day, would have trouble squeezing itself down into a single N64 cartridge, but they managed to do it, and do it quite well. Really, the only major downgrade is the audio quality. Sure, it took pretty much everything the N64 had to run it, but that it worked at all shows how the industry was really underestimating the console at the time. Number 6, Metal Gear Solid 3 for the PlayStation 2. The PlayStation 2 is one of, if not the greatest console in gaming history, but even this legendary bit of tech had its limits. Several games really did come within spitting distance of it though. Say hello to Metal Gear Solid 3. All of the Metal Gear games that aren't, 2D or named Survive are some of the most graphically intense games for their respective systems, but 3 in particular stands out for just how far it took things on the PS2, pulling off a graphical fidelity you just didn't get with other games on the system. Dynamic lighting and shading, tons of unique facial movements and expressions, and an environment that was filled with wildlife that would react pretty realistically to your presence, including bugs that move in response to wind and your proximity to them. You would not be met with any shock if you told people that Snake Eater was an early PS3 game instead of the truth. It was a title released smack dab in the middle of the PlayStation 2's lifespan, and yes, it looked this good. Number 5, Red Dead Redemption 2, PlayStation 4. Rockstar Games have garnered a reputation for being the graphical benchmark of the generation they release into, and nowhere is that more apparent than in Red Dead Redemption 2. No other game, not even RDR2's own predecessor back on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, truly captures the feel of being in the Wild West in the 1800s. The land is vast and grand, but intimate and dangerous. Civilization is mostly just a suggestion instead of anything tangible. Most importantly, horses' testicles shrink in the cold. The entire game would simply fall apart if that detail didn't make it in. Jokes aside, such wide breadth yet intimate detail is the kind of thing that would break other dev teams, and indeed RDR2's developers were pushed to the breaking point by their unreasonable bosses to make this game happen. But they did indeed make it happen, and this modern American epic put the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and the standard spec PCs at the time through their paces. This is the kind of game that you can only make if you have a lot of money to burn, and Rockstar sure has cash to spare thanks to GTA Online. Hopefully next time around they can do it without the genuine human cost, but it doesn't change the fact that Red Dead Redemption 2 is still one of the most stunning games today. Number 4, Doom for the Super Nintendo. There are many ports of the original Doom, all of which have one quality better or worse than all of the others. It's quite hilarious how none of the ports of Doom are a perfect one-to-one version of the original PC release. And on the lesser end of the spectrum, we have the poor Super Nintendo port of the game, a system that Doom flat out did not belong on. Not because Nintendo tried doing some kind of silly censorship stuff like they did with Mortal Kombat, but because the game was just too advanced for what the Super Nintendo could handle. While the game did make it onto the SNES, it did so bit crushed to hell and back. Not just the graphics, but the music came out crunchier than when it came in, and mind you, Doom is an early PC shooter, so it was already pretty crunchy. Doom simply had no business being on this console, it being clearly a hard fit to get the whole experience somewhat intact on this less advanced system. id Software would learn their lesson next time with Doom 64, straight up building an entire game within the limitations of the console they were working on. Number 3, Star Fox, Super Nintendo. Back in the 90s, new graphical advancements were happening almost every day. Every new leap in graphics tech was immediately recognisable as, in capitals, a big deal, because it was all uncharted territory. These days, the change from 4K to 8K isn't quite as immediately obvious as, say, from 2D to 3D. Enter the original Star Fox, the Super Nintendo game so advanced it needed a whole new software chip installed to make it work. The Super FX chip allowed for 3D polygonal graphics to render onto the normally sprite-based SNES. It was a huge advancement for the system and the industry at the time, and Star Fox displayed just what it was capable of. Star Fox is the good side of the same coin that rests SNES Doom. It pushes the console to its absolute limits, but is clearly made with those limits in mind so that the whole thing can gel together better. The result is a stone-cold classic of the Super Nintendo library. Number 2, The Last of Us, PlayStation 3. Words cannot describe the enormity of The Last of Us's impact when it first came out. Much like Undertale a few years later, you just had to be there to truly get it. The reason that Naughty Dog's constant re-releases of this game, first a remaster, then a remake, feel so absurd is that the game still looks amazing to this day. Definitely an achievement on the PS3, which, despite having some excellent features of its own, just had too many millstones around its neck to hold a candle to its contemporary, the Xbox 360. The Last of Us was the perfect game to showcase the PS3's best graphical qualities, that being its lighting and character model details. The characters in The Last of Us look so consistently wary, beaten down and filthy all the time, and thanks to the PS3's advanced lighting, the world manages to look realistically beautiful and threatening at once. Whilst its sequel is the bigger graphical powerhouse, the way the original worked its hardware to the limit should also be recognised. And number 1, Crysis. Can it run Crysis? This question dominated the graphic benchmark scene for years. Crytek and Saber Interactive's graphical magnum opus, due to a combination of experimental new tech and just really bad optimization, led Crysis to be the measuring stick for new graphics cards for almost a decade. Literally nothing ran Crysis for much of its original shelf life. Sure, these days you can play it pretty fine on high settings on most standard PC setups. Back then, however, you were lucky or very wealthy if you got that baby to purr consistently at 20 frames a second. The game is chock full of FPS tropes that we currently take for granted, and it did them long before anything else. Destructible environments, an open world with enemies moving independently of your action, zero gravity sections, and more were found in this trailblazer of a game that basically no one could play. Whoops.